Genesis 5. Genesis 5. And it reads, it says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam in the day that God created man. In the likeness of God made he him. Male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam in the day when they were created. And Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness, after his own image, and called his name Seth. And the days of Adam after he had begotten Seth were 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters. And all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. And Seth lived 105 years, and begat Enos. And Seth lived after he begat Enos 807 years, and begat sons and daughters." Verse 8, "And all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. And Enos lived 90 years, and begat Canaan. And Enos lived after he begat Canaan 815 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enos were 905 years, and he died. And Canaan lived 70 years, and begat Mahalalel. And Canaan lived after he begat Mahalalel 840 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Canaan were 910 years, and he died. And Mahalalel lived 65 years, and begat Jared. And Mahalalel lived after he begat Jared 830 years, and begat sons and daughters." Verse 17, "And all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. And Jared lived 162 years, and he begat Enoch. And Jared lived after he begat Enoch 800 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died." Now, a lot of times when we get to Bible verses like this, many of us do our Bible study reading. We want to read through the Bible in a year and all this type of stuff. And we get to chapters like this, and it's like, oh, wow. So-and-so begat so-and-so. So-and-so begat so-and-so. Why do we need to know all of this? All right. And part of the reason that this is here, I believe, due to the wisdom of God, is that God gives us details to let us know that, number one, his word is real, and that the people that we talk about in the Bible were actually real people and not just some fables, Little Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, or whatever, that these were actually real people that lived. So that's why God goes through the trouble of giving us details about ages. When this man was 75, he had this child, and when this man died, this happened. And it gives us this detail. But not only that, I believe God knew that one day man was going to challenge his authority in terms of creation and in terms of how we got here and things of that nature, because God knew that man one day was just going to want to disassociate himself with God. So God says, I'm just going to lay out the facts and the proof that I am the creator, and that this is how the world was created, and this is how the world was populated, and this is the number of years that has transpired since the world began. And I believe that's why God has given us this information, because I think it's in the book of Isaiah, it said that God's word would never go out void. So when he speaks it, it's going to last. And scientists, and I'm not saying all scientists, there are many Christian scientists. Some of the most famous, the guy who invented the MRI, which is practically in every hospital, that guy was a Christian. Now, he didn't receive the Nobel Peace Prize for that. They gave it to somebody else, but I digress. That was just due to the fact they didn't like what he believed. But anyway, so there are a lot of Christian scientists, but you also have a lot of scientists who are atheistic in nature, and they want to do whatever they can to say that God is not real. And so they come up with all these millions and billions of years and all this type of stuff. Well, God lays it out quite plainly here. If you look back to verse number 1 of chapter 5, it says, "This is the book of the generations." Now, this is the first time you see the word book used. Many archaeologists will debate when man first developed a written language. But obviously, written language was developed quite a while ago, because it says this is the book of the generation here. And it's talking about this is compiled written evidence of the generations or the genealogy leading from Adam. And it says, "In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him. Male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam." Notice that nowhere in Scripture do we find where God calls the woman Eve. He always referred to her as woman. Why have you done this? Or woman, what did you do here? It's Adam who actually gives Eve her name. But by the same token, this is where we get the idea of marriage where the lady takes on the man's name, right? Mr. and Mrs. John Smith, Mr. and Mrs. Danny Poindexter, or whatever. A lot of people probably don't say that anymore. I know at weddings, a lot of times after the couple get married at the wedding, they say, now introducing to you Mr. and Mrs., and then they give the man's name, because the lady takes on the husband's name. Here we see Eve taking on the name of Adam, because it's called their name, Adam. All right? This is why it's important to study these first few books of the Bible, because this sets the standard for the reason we do the things that we do today. All right, any questions about that? Okay, and you see in verse number 3, it says Adam lived 130 years and he begat a son, and this son was named Seth. Now, more than likely, Adam had Cain and Abel much earlier, because we know Seth was his third son here, and we know that based upon our previous readings from Genesis 4, that Seth didn't come until after Cain and Abel. All right, but he was at least 130 years when he had Seth, and it says all the days of Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. So Adam lived a very long time. A lot of people will want to debate this when you start getting into these people who live 900 years, 500 years, 600 years. They say, "Oh no, that's an error." All right, there's got to be something wrong there. No man has lived that long, and things of that nature. And the fact of the matter is that, once again, the Bible is true, and I believe the reason that a lot of these people lived as long as they did, especially people like Adam, was because when everything was in the Garden of Eden, it was perfect. There was no corruption, there was no sin, there was no disease. And so you're taking a perfect man, and I'm not saying Adam was perfect within himself. I'm saying God made Adam and Eve perfectly. You take those perfect people out of the perfect environment, which is the Garden of Eden, they're going to die, but they're not going to die as quickly because they don't have to deal with all the cancer and other diseases and stuff that we deal to today. They had not, there was not that much corruption in the world. And so you start off with perfection, and over a period of time, things devolve. Okay? Not evolve. Things devolve, okay?
They had to live longer to populate the earth. All those people had to live a long time to get the earth populated.
And there were a lot of people, by the time you reached Noah, it's estimated that there was a very significant number of people in the world, because a lot of people really didn't die. They just lived for a very long time because, as I said, it took a while for disease and other things to come into place. So things devolved over time, and this plays right perfectly into the laws of physics. The laws of physics, the second law of thermodynamics deals with entropy, that talks about how things dissipate or become more chaotic over time. To give you an example, you take a hot apple pie out of the oven and you set it on the windowsill. What happens? Well, that pie cools down, right? Why does it cool down? Because it dissipates the heat. Heat seeks out cold, all right? Heat doesn't seek out more heat unless there's some external force that's causing that to happen, all right? And so the second law of thermodynamics says that things really devolve or dissipate or change over time. And so here's a case where that fits perfectly in here, which is unlike, you talk about the Big Bang, where, everything, the universe, if you have this Big Bang, and then all of a sudden, as a result of this Big Bang, everything is perfect. Well, no, that's the opposite of what physics teaches. And scientists know that that's the opposite of physics teaches. That's like me having a bag of marbles. I throw the marbles out on the floor, and it forms a perfect image of the painting, the Mona Lisa. Is it possible that can happen? Yeah, but the chances of that happening is 1 in a quadrillion, right? And so we see right here that the way the Bible explains it, things actually become worse and worse over a period of time. The further the generation got from God, the less these people started living, and then the more people started degenerating. Yes, go ahead.
So would it be safe to say that food had more nutrients back then than it does now? Meaning like stuff that you grow, though, not because there's not as much pollution. There wasn't really any pollution.
Right. I mean, that's a very good point. The environment was more pristine back then. You didn't have pesticides and all this other stuff that you may find in fruit and vegetables and things today. So yeah, the environment was a lot cleaner. There was obviously less pollution starting out then than you have now. So you take in those environmental factors, like you said, yeah, that would have a lot to introduce to the table in terms of how long someone would live under those circumstances.
And they're constantly coming up with some type of new disease that somebody has got never heard of.
Right. They're always inventing new. Every year you got to get a different flu shot because the virus keeps changing on you. It's not like you just take one flu shot and you're done. The virus keeps changing, and so it's a downward spiral. But I believe that because Adam was directly made by God and his offspring were just one or two generations from someone who was directly made by God, that is the reason that they lived these hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, some people will say, well, if you read the Bible, the people who wrote the Bible, they made a typo. They added an extra zero, and it shouldn't have been there. You actually need to divide by 10 in order to get the right results. Adam was really 90 years old instead of 900 years old or whatever. But if that's the case, then how can you explain verses like verse number 9, where it says, and Enos lived 90 years and begat Canaan? Well, if you divide that by 10, what does that mean? He was 9? Look at verse number 15. And Mahalalel lived 65 years and begat Jared. So what does that mean? He was 6.5 years old when he had a child? So you see, and I believe God puts this information in here to dispute those people who refuse to believe that there were people who lived 800, 900 years old. Okay, but this is what the Bible says. We believe it to be true. And we also, because of the story of Noah, we have proof that during this time that there were at least 11-month or 12-month years. Okay, a year wasn't just a couple of months. Because if a year was just 2 months, then you could say, yeah, the guy lived 900 years, because you're just doing 2-month years. But the Bible gives us so much detail that we know that we're dealing with actual 12-month years and 24-hour days. I mean, it says that in Genesis 1 from the very beginning. Genesis 1, verse 14. Genesis 1:14 said, and God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. God already had established that. Now, the Hebrew calendar is a little different than what we have right now, the Roman calendar. The Hebrew calendar normally recognized a month as one full moon cycle to another full moon cycle. And they considered that a month. As a matter of fact, that's where we get the word month from. It's short for month, for the moon, for the cycle of the moon, month. All right? But still, even using the Hebrew calendar, you're still just only off a few days from a regular calendar year. I want to show you something real quick, and then we'll get back to verse number 6 if we have time. I want you to look at chapter 8 of Genesis. Chapter 8 of Genesis. Chapter 8 of Genesis. This is dealing with the story of Noah. I know I'm jumping ahead, but I want to show you where during the time of Adam on through Noah and all this, that we were actually dealing with 12-month years, or 12 months in a year. If you look at Genesis 8 and you look at the 5th verse, it says, and the waters decreased continually until the what? 10th month. So we already know that there's at least 10 months in a year that these people were celebrating, right? 10th month, and the 10th month on the first day of the month were the tops of the mountains seen. Look at this next verse, and it says in verse 6, it says, and it came to pass at the end of 40 days. Okay, so now you got the 10th month. The 10th month plus 40 days, that's another month, isn't it? That's another month and 10 days. All right. Now, if you look a little further in verse number, I'm looking for the statement on 7 days. Verse number 10. Let me see, 40 days. And then verse number 10 says he stayed yet another 7 days. So that's an additional week. And then in verse number 12, it said he stayed yet another 7 days. So now you're 10 days into this 12th month. You got 7 days passed by another 7 days. So that's like 24 days right there. That's almost another month. Y'all see that? Am I going too crazy or too fast? Does that make sense? Okay, so now look what happens in verse number 13 of Genesis chapter 8. It says, and it came to pass in the 601st year, in the what? First month of the year. Okay, so now we've gone back to the first month. Okay, so you see, we started out with the 10th month. We went another 40 days. That's the 11th month. And then we had a couple of extra days in there. We had at least another 24 days. And then it says, and it came to pass, the first month shows up again. All right. So this is proof to me that we are dealing with 12 months in a year. And that when these people were living 900, 800 years old, it was using a calendar almost identical to what we were using. All right. And you look at these details that they give here in Noah and you say, well, why does God give us all these details? Because he wants us to know that these events were real. And so this is why he gives us a log and a lot of detail of what happens here. And you can turn back to Genesis 5 for a moment here.
Well, that's by the seasons
yes.
that he produced. You're going to have winter.
Yes, winter.
One year you're going to have winter, and a year from there you're going to have another winter.
Yeah, and so that is established exactly what you said, Brother Robbie, in Genesis, the first chapter, verse 14. God established the seasons, the days, and the years. All of that was already established. And so when we read about these people living all these hundreds of years, we need to take heart to the fact that these things are true. Okay? All right? So, yes, sir, go ahead.
I wonder is, why did these people live so long, like 70, 80 years before they had their first child? Because they couldn't afford it earlier and they had to establish their life to have these kids? Or?
Well, here's the thing to keep in mind. Just because it says that so-and-so was like, we look at Enos, where it says in verse number 9, Enos lived 90 years and he begat Canaan. That doesn't necessarily mean that was his first kid. That just means that he had a child at that time. Because if you look at this lineage, if you look at this genealogy is leading up to Noah. Okay? So that's not to say that, and it tells us, and he begat sons and daughters. You see that scattered throughout not only Adam, but you see where it says in verse number 7 that Seth begat sons and daughters. But it particularly talks about Enos in verse number 6. Okay? So we see where it says so-and-so was 70 years old and he begat a child. That doesn't necessarily mean that was his first child. That's just letting us know how old he was when he had that child. He may have had 100 children before he had this child. We don't know. All right. So when it says begat, that doesn't necessarily mean that was his firstborn unless we have other passages to back that up. Yes, go ahead.
You kind of answered the theory, though, as to why maybe it only mentions that child, meaning like, what I'm trying to say is, let's suppose, right, that was their first child.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So why would they have waited that long to have a child if that was their first child? That would kind of answer
Okay, Brother Robert's question. The answer to that is I do not know.
Well,
and actually, if you look at it, I'm sorry. If you look at it at verse number 9, where it says he lived 90 years and begat Canaan, I mean, that's actually kind of early compared to these other guys who were in their hundreds when they begat children.
Plus,
to
go back, it kind of answers it with when Seth come along. Because by the time Seth come along, Cain had already left and started his own family. So
yeah.
Adam and Eve had to have had some girls in there before Seth come along.
Yes,
so.
yes, that's correct. That's correct. I'm sorry, go ahead.
What I was going to say is it tells the ages of the guys.
Yes.
It doesn't tell the ages of these women.
Yes.
And these women could be much younger.
That's true.
You know?
That's true.
And,
we don't know.
And these guys, they're roaming the world in their sandals and looking for, the rugged terrain and everything, looking for a mate, and they find one and could be really young. I'm not saying childlike, but I'm saying certainly not 90 years old.
Well, we have to keep in mind.
We don't know that.
Well, we do know how old Eve was when she had Seth. We do know how old Eve was because she was made the same day Adam was. And it says Adam was 130 years old. So how old was Eve when she had Seth?
Yeah. But
so,
we don't know the lineage after that.
I think it's like you said, they had a lot of kids because Cain had to have had a wife before Seth was born. So
Yes,
he had
yes,
to have
yes,
had
yes.
some girls in there somewhere.
Yes, yes. They're just not mentioned. Yeah.
They're just not mentioning it.
Right, right. But the point I was trying to make about Eve being as old as Adam is that it may not have been uncommon for a woman to be well past her hundreds and still having children. So it wouldn't necessarily be that, Methuselah is a 969-year-old man. He's a dirty old man looking at a spry 50-year-old. His wife may have been almost as old as him. We just don't know.
And
All right.
wasn't a newborn baby when God put her on the earth either, right? Like she would have been a grown woman.
She would have been a grown woman, correct. Yeah, so you have to take that. And this is another thing that defies science, and we're going to have to dismiss. Can you imagine if to show you the difference between the Bible and science, if science had an opportunity to analyze Adam and Eve that first day, they would have said, oh, Adam, this is a 20-year-old man or a 25-year-old man, according to their scientific testing. But the reality was Adam was a day old when he was made a man. He wasn't made a woman, And I still, to me, I can't teach this, but I don't believe he had a belly button because he didn't have an earthly mom. Okay, but I can't teach that. Okay, God may have made him with the belly button. I don't know, but you don't need that to get to heaven. So who cares? All right, that's just some funny stuff to talk about. But anyway, now I forgot where I was going with this. I just totally went off the rails.
Belly button blew your mind, huh?
Yeah, it did. But, these are all fascinating questions, but, we really don't know the answer to the ages of the women, how many sons and daughters were produced. We know that Adam and Eve had sons and daughters. We know that some of these Seth had sons and daughters. We don't know if they had 4, 10, 20. We just don't know. But the Lord is giving us this particular detail because it wants to establish the genealogy leading up to Noah, which is going to be the genealogy that leads up to Abraham, which is going to be the genealogy, more importantly, that leads up to David. And King David is going to be the genealogy that leads up to Jesus. And you can read about Jesus' genealogy in Matthew, the 1st chapter, and also in the book of Luke as well. All right. And so, unfortunately, the siblings who are not part of that line, they kind of get cast to the side. You don't know much about them because God is just trying to establish that main line that's going to take us to Jesus, to say, hey, we've already put the promise in motion. It's going to be through this line that we're going to deliver the promise of the Messiah. And so it doesn't focus on the other brothers and sisters. They're just left out, unfortunately. All right. Okay. We're going to have to dismiss.